Madison Chen, a dedicated teacher from a struggling public school, never imagined that tutoring a troubled teenager would change her life forever. When she offered free lessons to a millionaire's rebellious son, no one believed in her motives. But when both father and son transformed through her kindness, the truth about compassion, second chances, and genuine connection changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Today, Alexander Wright surveyed the Seattle skyline from his executive office on the 40th floor. At 45, he had everything money could buy. A tech empire worth billions, respect from industry titans, and a sprawling mansion in the hills. The only thing he couldn't seem to purchase was a solution for his 16-year-old son's downward spiral. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Wright, your 3 o'clock appointment is here," his assistant announced. "Send her in," Alexander replied, straightening his tie. The door opened and a young woman with shoulder-length dark hair entered. She wore simple, professional attire, dark slacks and a modest blouse, standing out from the parade of power suits that typically filed through his office. "Mr. Wright, I'm Madison Chen. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Alexander gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please sit. I understand you're my son's literature teacher?" "Yes, for the past year at Westlake High," Madison replied. Her posture straight but not rigid. There was a quiet confidence about her that Alexander hadn't expected. "And you requested this meeting to discuss Jason's academic performance?" "Partly," Madison nodded. "But more importantly, to discuss Jason himself." Alexander leaned back, studying her. "His grades are abysmal. I'm already aware. Grades are just symptoms, Mr. Wright. I'm more concerned with the cause." "Which is?" His tone was clipped, defensive. Madison didn't flinch. "Jason is struggling with more than academics. He's withdrawn, angry, and increasingly isolated from his peers. But beneath that, I see a brilliant mind and a deeply sensitive young man who's hurting." Alexander's jaw tightened. "I've hired the best therapists in the state." "And I'm sure they're excellent," Madison acknowledged. "But Jason needs more than therapy. He needs someone who believes in him unconditionally." "You think I don't believe in my own son?" Madison chose her words carefully. "I think you believe in his potential. But right now, Jason doesn't believe in himself. That's the disconnect." Alexander stood, walking to the window. This wasn't the conversation he'd expected. Most teachers approached him with complaints about Jason's behavior or requests for donations to the school. This woman seemed genuinely concerned about his son as a person. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Chen?" "I'd like to tutor Jason, one-on-one, after school hours." "No charge." Alexander turned sharply. "No charge? Why would you do that?" Madison met his gaze directly. "Because money isn't what Jason needs right now. He needs consistent support from someone who sees his value beyond his family name or his grades." "And you think you're that person?" Alexander's skepticism was evident. "I know I can connect with him," Madison said simply. "I've seen glimpses of who Jason really is when he thinks no one is watching. The way he helped a freshman who was being bullied. How he loses himself in poetry when he thinks no one will judge him for it." Alexander returned to his desk, intrigued despite himself. "Jason hasn't mentioned any of this to me. When was the last time you asked him about something other than his grades or behavior reports?" The question stung with its accuracy. When had he last had a real conversation with his son? Since Eliza's death 3 years ago, their relationship had deteriorated into a series of confrontations and disappointed silences. "Ms. Chen, I appreciate your concern, but I can hire the most qualified tutors in the country." "Qualifications aren't everything, Mr. Wright," Madison replied. "Jason doesn't need another adult telling him what's wrong with him. He needs someone who sees what's right with him." Something in her unwavering conviction gave Alexander pause. "Tell me about your background." "I graduated from UW with honors in education and English literature. I've been teaching for 5 years, the last 2 at Westlake. I specialize in connecting with students who others have given up on." And what makes you think Jason hasn't driven you away in 2 weeks like every other tutor I've hired? Madison smiled slightly. Because I'm not doing this for the money, and Jason knows it. That changes the dynamic completely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Alexander studied her thoughtfully. Why do you care this much about my son, Miss Chen? Madison's expression softened. Because someone once believed in me when everyone else had written me off. Sometimes one person's faith is all it takes to change a life trajectory. After a long moment, Alexander nodded. 2 weeks. If I don't see improvement, we end this arrangement. Fair enough, Madison agreed, rising from her seat. But I should be clear about something. Improvement doesn't always look like better grades immediately. Look for changes in his engagement, his mood, his willingness to communicate. When do you want to start? Tomorrow after school, if that works for Jason. Alexander extended his hand. I'll have my driver bring him to your classroom. Madison shook her head. Actually, I'd like to meet him in the public library downtown. Neutral territory is important. As she turned to leave, Alexander called after her. Miss Chen? Why refuse payment? Teachers aren't exactly overpaid. Madison paused at the door. Some things are more valuable than money, Mr. Wright. The moment we put a price tag on Jason's potential is the moment we limit what he can become. With those words hanging in the air, she left, leaving Alexander with the unsettling feeling that this unassuming teacher had seen through his carefully constructed facade in ways few people ever had. The following afternoon, Jason slouched in a chair at the downtown library, headphones blaring, hood pulled over his dark hair. At 16, he had his father's strong features but his mother's expressive eyes currently narrowed in suspicion as Madison approached. You can take those off now, she said, pointing to his headphones. Jason reluctantly removed them. Let me guess. My father's paying you extra to fix the family disappointment? Madison set her bag down and took the seat across from him. Actually, I refused payment. That caught him off guard. What? This isn't about money, Jason, and you're not a disappointment. He scoffed. You don't know anything about me. I know you wrote a poem last semester that made me cry. I know you have a mind that makes connections others miss. And I know you're in pain, which is making everything else harder than it needs to be. Jason stared at her, momentarily speechless. Then his walls slammed back into place. So what's your angle then? Building your teacher resume with a charity case? No angle, Madison replied calmly. But I don't expect you to believe that yet. Trust is earned. She pulled out a battered copy of The Outsiders and slid it across the table. We're starting with this. Jason picked up the book skeptically. Isn't this middle school reading? Sometimes we need to revisit the basics to find what we missed the first time around. For the next hour, Madison didn't push. She simply opened conversations about the book's themes of belonging and identity, carefully drawing parallels without making them obvious. By the end of the session, Jason had unconsciously leaned forward, engaged in spite of himself. Same time Thursday? Madison asked as they packed up. Jason shrugged, affecting indifference. Whatever. Not like I have a choice. You always have a choice, Jason. That's the one thing no one can take from you. 2 weeks stretched into a month. 3 times weekly, Madison met with Jason at the library. Progress was hardly linear. Some days brought breakthrough discussions. Others were battles against his entrenched defenses. But gradually, subtle changes emerged. Jason started arriving on time. The permanent scowl softened. He began completing assignments, not just for her class, but others as well. Alexander noticed the changes too. Jason still avoided him, but the explosive arguments had decreased. One evening, he passed his son's room and paused, surprised to hear him quietly playing guitar, a hobby abandoned after his mother's death. At their next parent-teacher meeting, Alexander arrived early, curious about this woman who had accomplished what an army of expensive specialists couldn't. He's making progress, Madison confirmed when he asked. But more importantly, he's starting to believe he can make progress. What exactly do you do in these sessions? Alexander asked. Madison smiled. We talk about literature, but really we talk about life through the lens of literature. It gives Jason distance to explore difficult emotions safely. And you're still refusing payment? Still refusing. Alexander leaned forward. Why? Everyone has a price. That's where you're wrong, Mr. Wright, Madison replied, her voice gentle but firm. The most valuable things in life can't be purchased. They can only be earned through trust and genuine connection. Something about her sincerity unsettled him. In Alexander's world, transactions were clear-cut. Madison Chen operated by different rules altogether, and it challenged everything he thought he understood. I'd like to see one of these sessions, he said abruptly. Madison hesitated. Jason might see that as an invasion of his privacy, of the safe space we've created. I need to understand what's happening with my son. Then ask him, Madison suggested. Have a conversation where you're truly listening, not waiting to respond or correct. The challenge in her words was unmistakable, and Alexander found himself uncharacteristically defensive. You think I don't know how to talk to my own son? Madison's expression softened. I think grief changes communication patterns in families. Sometimes an outside perspective helps reset those patterns. Alexander fell silent, struck by her insight. Eliza's death had shattered their family unit, leaving father and son circling each other like wounded animals, unable to bridge the gap of their shared loss. Start small, Madison advised into the silence. Ask about the poetry he's been writing. It's quite remarkable. Jason writes poetry? Alexander couldn't mask his surprise. Madison nodded. He has a natural gift for it. His perspective is unique, raw, but deeply insightful. That evening, Alexander found himself standing outside Jason's bedroom, hand raised to knock, frozen by uncertainty. When had simple communication with his son become so daunting? Taking a deep breath, he knocked. What? Jason's voice was guarded. Alexander opened the door to find his son at his desk, notebooks hastily shoved aside. I spoke with Miss Chen today? Jason's expression closed immediately. Let me guess. I'm still not measuring up? Actually, Alexander said carefully, she mentioned you've been writing poetry. I didn't know that. Surprise flickered across Jason's face, quickly masked by suspicion. So I'd like to read some, if you wanted to share it. Jason stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. Why? The simple question cut deeper than Alexander expected. When had his interest in his son's life become so unusual that it provoked suspicion? Because you're my son, he said simply. And I've missed knowing who you are. The naked honesty hung between them, fragile and unexpected. Jason looked away first, but not before Alexander caught the sheen of tears in his eyes. Maybe someday, Jason murmured. Not a yes, but not a flat refusal either. It felt like the first tentative step across a vast chasm. As Alexander left, he noticed a change in his son's room. Among the typical teenage clutter sat a neatly arranged shelf of books, classics he recognized from his own youth, alongside contemporary titles he didn't. Madison's influence, undoubtedly. The following week, Alexander made an unannounced visit to the library during one of their tutoring sessions. He stayed back, observing from a distance. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. Jason was animated, gesturing as he spoke, a spark of genuine enthusiasm in his expression that Alexander hadn't seen in years. Madison listened intently, nodding, occasionally challenging with a question that made Jason pause and reconsider. There was an ease between them, a mutual respect that made Alexander's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't immediately identify. Was it jealousy? No, something more complex. Gratitude mixed with regret that this stranger had found a way to reach his son when he couldn't. As he watched them, the professional wall he'd maintained toward Madison began to crumble. She wasn't just his son's teacher. She was becoming the bridge that might reunite his broken family. That night, Alexander made a decision. He called the school superintendent and arranged for a substantial anonymous donation, specifically earmarked for teacher development programs and classroom resources. It wasn't payment to Madison directly, but it was something he could do to support the work she clearly valued. 2 months into their tutoring arrangement, Jason brought home his first A in over 2 years, in Madison's literature class. Alexander found the paper on the kitchen counter, not hidden away as usual, but placed where he would see it. "This is excellent work," Alexander said at dinner, holding up the essay on The Great Gatsby. Jason shrugged, but a hint of pride showed through his attempt at nonchalance. "Miss Chen says I have a knack for analyzing character motivation." "She's right," Alexander replied sincerely. "This insight about Gatsby's relationship with the past, it's genuinely thoughtful. A fragile moment of connection stretched between them, both uncertain how to nurture it without breaking it. Maybe," Jason said hesitantly, "you could come to the poetry reading next week, at the bookstore downtown. Miss Chen suggested I read something I wrote." Alexander felt a swell of emotion that caught him by surprise. "I wouldn't miss it." Later that evening, Alexander called Madison to thank her. Their conversation, intended to be brief, stretched into an hour as they discussed Jason's progress. For the first time, Alexander found himself sharing the challenges of single parenthood, the helplessness he'd felt watching his son withdraw after Eliza's death. "Grief doesn't follow a timetable," Madison said gently, "for either of you." "I tried to fix everything with money," Alexander admitted. "Therapists, specialists, exclusive schools. I thought, if I threw enough resources at the problem, it would go away." "But Jason isn't a problem to be fixed," Madison observed. "He's a person navigating loss, just like you are." Her words struck with precision, illuminating the fundamental mistake he'd been making. He'd approached his son's suffering as a CEO rather than a father, looking for efficient solutions rather than understanding the human complexity of grief. "How did you get so wise about teenagers?" he asked. There was a pause before Madison answered. "I was Jason once. Lost, angry, feeling misunderstood. The teacher saw past my defenses and showed me another way forward. I'm just paying it forward." Alexander found himself wanting to know more about her story, about the person behind the insightful observations and unwavering commitment to his son. "Would you consider having dinner sometime?" To discuss Jason's progress in more detail? Another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Wright." "Alexander, please." "Alexander," she amended. "I need to maintain appropriate boundaries as Jason's teacher." "Of course." He backtracked quickly. "I didn't mean to suggest anything unprofessional. Perhaps we could meet at the school cafe after hours next week," Madison offered. More neutral ground. After hanging up, Alexander sat in his home office, contemplating the strange twist his life had taken. For years after Eliza's death, he'd immersed himself in work, building financial security that couldn't fill the emotional void left behind. Now, because of an unassuming teacher who refused his money, he was beginning to see what he'd been missing all along. The poetry reading arrived on a rainy Seattle evening. The small bookstore was packed with students, parents, and faculty from Westlake High. Alexander arrived early, securing a seat near the front. When Madison entered, their eyes met briefly across the room. She gave him a small nod of acknowledgement before turning her attention to the nervous students preparing to read. Jason was third on the program. As he approached the microphone, Alexander was struck by how much older his son suddenly looked. Less boy, more young man, on the cusp of finding himself. The transformation wasn't just physical, but in his bearing, the way he held himself with a tentative new confidence. "This poem is called Invisible Bridges," Jason announced, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He took a deep breath and began to read. The poem was raw, honest, about loss and disconnection, about a father and son separated by an ocean of unspoken grief, about the fragile threads beginning to stretch across that divide. Alexander sat transfixed, hearing his son's truth laid bare in verse, seeing their shared pain through Jason's eyes for the first time. When Jason finished, the silence held for a heartbeat before applause erupted. Alexander found himself on his feet, vision blurred with unexpected tears. Their eyes met across the room. Father and son, seeing each other clearly, perhaps for the first time since Eliza's death. After the readings concluded, Alexander made his way through the crowd toward Madison, who stood surrounded by proud parents and excited students. "You've done the impossible," he said when he finally reached her side. Madison shook her head. "Jason did the work. I just created the space for him to try." "You created more than space," Alexander insisted. You rebuilt his belief in himself. Before she could respond, Jason appeared at his father's side. What did you think? He asked, vulnerability clear in his question. Alexander placed a hand on his son's shoulder. I think your mother would have been incredibly proud of you tonight. I know I am. Jason's eyes widened at the mention of his mother, a subject they'd both avoided for so long. The wall between them cracked a little more as Jason gave a small, genuine smile. Ms. Chen says I should submit to the Young Writers Anthology, he said. You absolutely should, Alexander agreed. Then, to Madison. Would you join us for dinner? To celebrate Jason's success tonight? Madison hesitated, glancing between father and son. This should be a moment for the two of you. Please, Jason added unexpectedly. It wouldn't have happened without you. Her resolve visibly wavered. Just this once, then. To celebrate Jason's achievement. The dinner that followed was unlike any the Wright men had experienced in years. Conversation flowed naturally as Jason opened up about his writing, his renewed interest in music, and tentative plans for college, dreams that had seemed extinguished months earlier. Madison shared stories from her classroom, drawing Jason out with questions that revealed her deep understanding of his intellectual passions. Alexander found himself watching their interaction with growing admiration and something more personal he wasn't yet ready to name. As the evening wound down, Jason excused himself to speak with classmates he'd spotted across the restaurant, another positive sign of his re-engagement with peers. Left alone with Madison, Alexander finally asked the question that had been nagging at him. Why did you single out Jason? Out of all your students, why him specifically? Madison considered her answer carefully. Because beneath his anger, I recognized something familiar. A bright mind dulled by pain, using defiance as armor against more hurt. You said you were like him once? She nodded, tracing the rim of her water glass. My father left when I was 12. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. I was angry at the world, pushing away anyone who tried to help. What changed? My junior year English teacher, Mrs. Lowell, wouldn't give up on me. She saw past my hostility to the scared girl underneath. She lent me books that spoke to my experience and showed me how to channel my pain into something constructive. Madison smiled at the memory. She saved me, in many ways. Now I try to do the same for students like Jason. Well, Alexander said softly, now you've saved us both. Their eyes met across the table, a moment of connection that transcended their professional relationship. For the first time in 3 years, Alexander felt something stir within him, a recognition of possibility he'd thought died with Eliza. The moment was broken by Jason's return, but something had shifted between them. As Alexander drove them home later, watching Madison's figure recede in the rearview mirror as she walked toward her modest apartment building, he realized his life had reached an unexpected turning point. His son was finding his way back from the brink of self-destruction, and Alexander himself was awakening to emotions he'd buried alongside his wife, not replacing that love, but discovering that his heart still had capacity for new connections. What neither father nor son yet realized was that Madison Chen carried secrets of her own, complications that would test the fragile new bonds forming between them all. Because while she had indeed transformed their lives through her generosity of spirit, the full truth about her connection to the Wright family remained hidden, waiting to either strengthen their newfound bond or shatter it completely. As the weeks passed, Madison's tutoring sessions with Jason became the steady heartbeat of his academic recovery. His grades improved across all subjects, not just literature. More importantly, the angry, withdrawn teenager was gradually being replaced by a thoughtful young man who participated in class discussions and reconnected with old friends. Alexander observed these changes with a mix of gratitude and newfound hope. He'd begun rearranging his work schedule to be home more often, creating space for the tentative new relationship forming with his son. Small steps, helping with college research, attending Jason's school events, or simply sharing meals without the heavy silence that had previously defined their interactions. One evening in late October, Alexander arrived home earlier than expected to find Jason and Madison in the kitchen. Textbooks were spread across the island counter, but they weren't studying. Instead, they were cooking together, laughing as Jason attempted to flip something in a pan. Wrist movement, not arm, Madison was saying, Like this, she demonstrated with easy confidence. Dad! Jason noticed him first, surprisingly without the usual guardedness. Ms. Chen is teaching me how to make Mom's paella recipe. Alexander froze in the doorway. Your mother's recipe? Madison wiped her hands on a kitchen towel, looking slightly uncomfortable. Jason mentioned it was a dish Eliza used to make that he missed. I asked if he had the recipe. I found Mom's recipe box in the back of the pantry, Jason explained. We haven't used it since. The unfinished sentence hung between them. Since she died. Since everything fell apart. I hope you don't mind, Madison added quietly. It seemed like a good way to honor her memory. While teaching Jason some practical skills, Alexander moved further into the kitchen, drawn by the familiar aroma that suddenly transported him back to happier times. I don't mind, he said, his voice rough with emotion. It's actually perfect. Jason held out a wooden spoon. Want a taste? I think we got the saffron right. Such a simple gesture, yet so profound in what it represented. Alexander accepted the spoon, tasting the rich flavor that immediately evoked memories of Sunday family dinners, Eliza's laughter, and a time when their home had been filled with warmth. It's exactly right, he said, meeting his son's eyes with genuine connection. Madison began gathering her things. I should go and let you two enjoy dinner together. Stay, Alexander found himself saying. Please, you helped create this moment. You should be part of it. Jason nodded in agreement. There's plenty. After a moment's hesitation, Madison nodded. All right, thank you. That dinner marked a subtle but significant shift. As they ate, shared stories, and even laughed together, Alexander realized they were becoming something he'd never expected. A different kind of family, held together not by traditional bonds, but by something equally powerful, shared healing. When Madison eventually left, Alexander walked her to the door. I've never seen him talk about Eliza like that, he said quietly, with fondness instead of pain. Madison smiled. Grief changes shape over time if we let it. Sometimes the way forward is through remembering, not avoiding. You're changing our lives, Madison. I don't know how to thank you. Seeing Jason thrive is thanks enough, she replied. Then, with slight hesitation, but there's something I should tell you. Something important. Before she could continue, her phone rang. She glanced at it, her expression immediately shifting to concern. I'm sorry, I have to take this. My grandmother's caregiver. Alexander nodded, understanding. Of course. We can talk another time. As Madison answered the call and hurried to her car, Alexander was left wondering what she had been about to share. The question lingered as he returned to the kitchen, where Jason was already cleaning up. Ms. Chen is pretty cool, isn't she? Jason said casually, though something in his tone suggested the question was anything but casual. She is, Alexander agreed, picking up a dish towel. She's made an enormous difference for you. For us, Jason corrected, giving his father a sidelong glance. I see how you look at her, you know. Alexander nearly dropped the plate he was drying. That's not. She's your teacher. And? Jason challenged. Mom's been gone 3 years, Dad. She wouldn't want you to be alone forever. The maturity in his son's observation caught Alexander off guard. It's complicated, Jason. Life is complicated, Jason replied, mimicking his father's often used phrase with a small smile. Doesn't mean you run from the good parts when they come along. Later that night, Alexander sat in his home office, turning over Jason's words. Was his interest in Madison that transparent? And was it merely gratitude for her help with Jason, or something deeper? The truth was uncomfortable but undeniable. In Madison Chen, with her quiet strength, unwavering principles, and capacity for compassion, he'd found someone who made him want to be better. Someone who challenged his worldview in ways that felt both unsettling and necessary. His computer pinged with a new email. A background check report he'd requested weeks ago but had forgotten about in the midst of recent developments. Standard procedure, his assistant had assured him, for anyone working closely with Jason. Alexander hesitated before opening it. It felt invasive now, a betrayal of the trust that had developed. But professional caution prevailed, and he clicked the file open. Most was expected. Madison's education credentials, previous employment, clean criminal record. But as he scrolled further, an entry caught his attention, causing him to sit up straight. 8 years ago, Madison Chen had been involved in a civil lawsuit against Prometheus Pharmaceuticals, a company that Wright Innovations had acquired just last year. The details were minimal, but it appeared she had been part of a class action settlement involving a medication called Nevarex. Alexander frowned, trying to place why that sounded familiar. Then he remembered Nevarex had been a controversial cancer treatment drug. The lawsuit had been quietly settled before Wright Innovations purchased the company, the records sealed, and the whole matter buried in acquisition paperwork. But why would Madison have been involved? She would have been barely 20 at the time. Unless... The realization hit him with sudden clarity. Madison had mentioned her father leaving when she was 12. Had her mother been one of the patients affected by Nevarex? Was that the personal connection that drove her interest in Jason? The thought that Madison might have ulterior motives, perhaps seeking proximity to the Wright family for revenge or financial gain, sent a cold wave through him. Had her refusal of payment been merely a clever tactic? Alexander closed the file, troubled by doubts that now crowded his mind. The woman who had begun to inhabit his thoughts with increasing frequency suddenly seemed shrouded in questions. He needed answers, but confronting her directly felt premature without more information. The next morning, he called his legal team and requested all available records on the Nevarex settlement. Then, against his better judgment, he had his assistant reschedule all afternoon appointments and drove to Westlake High during Madison's planning period. He found her in her classroom, surrounded by stacks of student essays. She looked up in surprise when he appeared in her doorway. "Alexander? Is everything all right with Jason?" "Jason's fine," he assured her, closing the door behind him. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation last night. You mentioned there was something important to tell me." Madison set down her pen, her expression shifting subtly. "Yes, there is. I've been trying to find the right moment." Alexander took a seat across from her desk, steeling himself. "I'm listening." Madison took a deep breath. "It's about my grandmother. She's been in declining health, and her medical bills have become overwhelming. I've been working a second job on weekends, but it's not enough." She looked down at her hands. "I've been offered a position at a private academy in Portland. The salary would be nearly double what I make here, with benefits that would cover her care." Alexander sat back, caught off guard by this unexpected direction. "You're leaving?" "I haven't decided yet," Madison said quietly. "The position starts next semester. I'm torn because leaving mid-year feels like abandoning my students, especially Jason." Relief washed over Alexander, immediately followed by a new concern. "Jason would be devastated if you left." "I know." Madison's eyes reflected genuine conflict. "That's why this decision has been so difficult." Alexander processed this information, the suspicions from last night temporarily receding. What if there were other options? "For your grandmother's care?" Madison shook her head firmly. "I appreciate what you're thinking, but I can't accept financial help, Alexander. That would cross too many lines. What about a legitimate scholarship for Jason's ongoing tutoring? The Wright Foundation supports educational initiatives. It wouldn't be charity. It would be compensation for professional services. It still feels inappropriate given our situation." Madison chose her words carefully. "Our situation?" Alexander questioned. Madison met his gaze directly. "You know what I mean. Things have become personal in ways that complicate professional boundaries." The acknowledgement hung between them. The first time either had openly addressed the growing connection that extended beyond Jason's tutoring. Before Alexander could respond, a knock at the classroom door interrupted them. The school principal entered, looking between them with barely concealed curiosity. "Mr. Wright, this is an unexpected pleasure. I trust everything is going well with Jason?" "Very well," Alexander confirmed, standing. "Miss Chen's tutoring has been transformative. I was just expressing my gratitude." Madison rose as well, professional composure firmly in place. "Mr. Wright has been incredibly supportive of Jason's academic journey." The principal beamed. "Miss Chen is one of our most dedicated faculty members. We're fortunate to have her, though I understand we may be losing her to Portland Academy soon." Alexander's eyes snapped to Madison, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Nothing is decided," she said quickly. After a few more minutes of conversation, Alexander excused himself, promising to continue their discussion another time. As he walked to his car, the mixture of emotions was disorienting. Relief that Madison's secret appeared to be financial struggles rather than hidden motives, concern about her potential departure. And beneath it all, the question about NeverX still unanswered. That afternoon, his legal team delivered the sealed records on the pharmaceutical lawsuit. Alexander sat alone in his office as evening fell, the file unopened on his desk. Did he have the right to investigate Madison's past this way? Was he looking for reasons to mistrust her because getting close to someone again felt too vulnerable? Finally, professional caution won out. He needed to protect Jason from potential manipulation, even if it meant invading Madison's privacy. He opened the file and began reading. What he discovered left him shaken. Madison Chen had indeed been connected to the NeverX case, but not as he'd suspected. Her mother, Sophia Chen, had been prescribed NeverX during breast cancer treatment 8 years ago. The drug had caused severe, undisclosed side effects that accelerated her decline rather than helping. She had died within months, leaving 19-year-old Madison to care for her elderly grandmother alone. Sophia Chen's name appeared on the class action lawsuit, with Madison listed as her representative after death. The settlement had provided modest compensation, most of which, according to financial records, had gone toward paying off medical debts. Alexander closed the file, a heavy weight settling in his chest. Madison had every reason to resent him, to blame Wright Innovations for acquiring the company responsible for her mother's suffering. Yet she had never mentioned it, never shown any sign of harboring ill will. Instead, she had poured herself into helping his son heal from his own mother's loss. The parallels were too significant to be coincidental. Had she sought out Jason specifically because of their shared experience of maternal loss? The question troubled him deeply. Was her interest in Jason, and perhaps in Alexander himself, genuine, or part of some complex emotional response to her own unresolved grief? He needed to know, but confronting her with information obtained through a background check seemed guaranteed to destroy the trust they had built. As he drove home, Alexander grappled with how to proceed. The decision was made for him the following evening when Madison called to cancel Jason's tutoring session due to a family emergency. Her grandmother had been hospitalized after a fall, and Madison was at the medical center. "Go!" Jason urged when Alexander mentioned the situation during dinner. "Miss Chen would never cancel unless it was serious. She needs support." "It's not really my place," Alexander began. "Dad," Jason interrupted with surprising authority. "She's been there for us nonstop. Maybe it's time we're there for her." The wisdom in his son's words struck Alexander forcefully. He drove to Seattle Memorial, finding Madison in the ICU waiting room, alone and clearly exhausted. She looked up in surprise as he approached. "Alexander? What are you doing here?" "Jason and I were worried," he said simply, taking the seat beside her. "How is she?" Madison's composure cracked slightly. "Not good. She broke her hip in the fall, and at her age, with her existing health conditions." She trailed off, the implications clear. "Is there anything I can do?" Alexander asked gently. Madison shook her head, then reconsidered. "Actually, just having someone here helps. The waiting is the hardest part." They sat in companionable silence for a while before Madison spoke again. "My grandmother raised me after my mother died. She's all the family I have left." Alexander nodded, understanding. "Jason mentioned your mother passed away when you were in college?" "Cancer," Madison confirmed, unaware of how closely Alexander was watching her expression. A medication that was supposed to help made things worse instead. By the time the pharmaceutical company admitted there were undisclosed risks, it was too late for Mom. Here it was, the opening to address what he had discovered. Alexander chose his words with extreme care. "That medication, was it NeverX?" Madison's head snapped up, surprise evident in her eyes. "How did you know that?" The moment of truth had arrived. "Because Wright Innovations acquired Prometheus Pharmaceuticals last year," he admitted quietly. "The company that manufactured NeverX." Understanding dawned in Madison's expression, followed by something more complex. Not anger, as Alexander had expected, but a sad resignation. "So you know," she said simply. "I wondered if you would find out eventually." "Why didn't you tell me?" Alexander asked, the question that had been haunting him. Madison turned to face him fully. "At first, it didn't seem relevant to Jason's tutoring. Then, as things progressed, I worried how it would look, that you might think I had some hidden agenda in helping Jason." "Did you?" The question was direct, unavoidable. "Not the way you're thinking," Madison replied with equal directness. "When I first met Jason, I recognized the pain of losing a mother. It resonated with my own experience. I wanted to help him because I understood that specific kind of grief. And your feelings about Wright Innovations? About me?" Alexander pressed. Madison considered her answer carefully. "I was angry for a long time about what happened to my mother, but I learned that anger consumes the person who carries it, not those it's directed toward. Your company buying Prometheus years after the settlement doesn't make you personally responsible, but it does connect us in a way you chose not to disclose," Alexander pointed out. "Yes," Madison acknowledged, "and perhaps that was wrong of me. But I feared it would change how you saw my work with Jason, that you would question my motives rather than my methods." "Like I'm doing now," Alexander realized aloud. Madison nodded sadly. "I never approached Jason with any hidden agenda, Alexander. I genuinely care about him, and," she hesitated, "about you too, in ways that have nothing to do with the past." Before Alexander could respond, a doctor appeared in the waiting room doorway calling Madison's name. She rose immediately, tension visible in every line of her body. "Would you like me to come with you?" Alexander offered. After a moment's hesitation, Madison nodded. "Please." The news wasn't good. While the surgery had been successful, Marina Chen's overall condition was fragile. She would require extensive rehabilitation and round-the-clock care that Medicare would only partially cover, and that Madison could not provide alone while working full-time. "The Portland position is no longer optional," Madison said quietly as they left the consultation. "It's necessary." Alexander watched her struggle to maintain composure, admiring her strength even as he recognized the cost it extracted. The woman who had given so much to help his family was now facing her own crisis with the same quiet dignity. In that moment, all his suspicions and questions seemed petty and insignificant compared to the reality before him. Whether or not Madison's initial interest in Jason had been influenced by their parallel losses no longer mattered. What mattered was who she had proven herself to be through her actions. "Madison," he said as they walked toward the parking garage. "Let me help. Not as Jason's father, or as CEO of Wright Innovations, but as someone who cares about you." She shook her head. "I can't accept that kind of help from you, Alexander. It would change everything between us." "Things are already changing," he pointed out gently. "Have been for weeks now." Madison stopped walking, turning to face him directly. "That's exactly why I need to maintain boundaries. My feelings for you and Jason are real, but they're complicated by our circumstances. Adding financial dependence to that mix would be a mistake." "Then what about a third option?" Alexander suggested. "Neither charity nor the Portland job." "What third option?" "The Wright Foundation has been developing a scholarship program for disadvantaged students. We need an experienced educator to design and implement it. The position includes competitive salary, full benefits, and flexible hours." Madison's expression shifted from surprise to skepticism. "You're creating a job for me?" "No," Alexander corrected. "I'm offering you a legitimate position that aligns with your skills and our needs. One that would allow you to remain in Seattle, continue working with students like Jason, and have the financial stability to arrange proper care for your grandmother." Madison studied his face, looking for signs of pity or manipulation. "Why would you do this?" Alexander took a careful step closer. "Because losing you would hurt Jason deeply. Because your work matters and deserves proper support. And because—" He paused, then decided on complete honesty. "Because I'm not ready to lose you either, Madison. Not when we're just beginning to understand what might be possible between us." The vulnerability in his admission hung in the air between them. Madison's expression softened, revealing a glimpse of her own carefully guarded feelings. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is a lot to process." "Of course," Alexander agreed. "Take all the time you need. Just promise you won't make any decisions about Portland without talking to me first." Madison nodded, then surprised him by reaching out to briefly touch his hand. "Thank you for coming tonight. It meant more than you know." As Alexander drove home, the complexity of their situation weighed heavily on his mind. The connection between Madison and his company's acquisition created complications he hadn't anticipated. Yet beneath those complications lay something increasingly precious, a relationship built on mutual respect and genuine care that transcended their respective pasts. What he couldn't know was that Madison's family history with Prometheus Pharmaceuticals contained deeper layers she hadn't yet revealed, truths that could either strengthen their emerging bond or shatter it completely. Because while she had been honest about her mother's death, Madison hadn't shared everything about her connection to the Nevrex case, or about the promise she had made to her mother in those final days. A promise that now stood in direct conflict with her growing feelings for Alexander Wright. The next morning dawned cold and clear. A rare, sunny November day in Seattle. Madison sat by her grandmother's hospital bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Alexander's job offer presented a lifeline she desperately needed, but accepting it felt dangerously close to compromising the principles she'd always lived by. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jason. "Hope your grandmother is doing better. Dad and I are thinking of you." The simple message brought unexpected tears to her eyes. In just a few months, Jason and Alexander had become important to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Ways that complicated the promise she'd made 8 years ago at her mother's bedside. "I'll make them accountable, Mom," she had whispered as Sophia Chen's life slipped away. "I'll make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else." Back then, her grief had crystallized into a single-minded mission: to expose Prometheus Pharmaceuticals' negligence and ensure justice for all the families affected by Nevrex. The class action settlement had felt hollow, a financial calculation rather than a moral reckoning. So Madison had formulated a longer-term plan, pursuing education as her path to influence young minds about corporate ethics and responsibility. When Wright Innovations acquired Prometheus last year, her focus had shifted. Alexander Wright became the new face of the company she'd silently battled for years. Learning that he had a son struggling with grief that mirrored her own, had seemed like providence, a chance to understand the human being behind the corporate entity. What she hadn't expected was to discover a man of genuine integrity struggling with his own demons, a father desperate to reconnect with his son, a person whose complexity defied the simple villain narrative she'd constructed in her mind. "Ms. Chen?" A nurse interrupted her thoughts. "Your grandmother's doctor would like to speak with you about discharge planning." Madison nodded, squeezing her grandmother's hand before following the nurse. The conversation with the doctor confirmed what she already knew. Her grandmother would need extensive rehabilitation, followed by permanent in-home care. The costs would be astronomical, far beyond what Madison could manage on a teacher's salary. As she returned to her grandmother's room, her phone rang. Alexander's name appeared on the screen. "How is she today?" he asked when she answered. "Stable," Madison replied. "They're talking about discharge plans already." "That sounds encouraging." "It's practical rather than optimistic," Madison clarified. "They need the bed. She'll be transferred to a rehabilitation facility, but insurance only covers 3 weeks. After that," she trailed off, the financial reality overwhelming. "Have you thought more about the foundation position?" Alexander asked gently. Madison sighed. "I have, but it's complicated, Alexander." "Because of our personal connection?" "Partly," she admitted. "And partly because of my history with Prometheus." A brief silence followed. "I think we need to talk about that more fully," Alexander said finally. "There's still something unresolved there. I can feel it." Madison's heart raced. He was perceptive. Too perceptive sometimes. "You're right," she acknowledged. "But not over the phone." "I understand. When would be a good time?" Before she could answer, a commotion in her grandmother's room caught her attention. Monitors were beeping, and medical staff rushed in. "I have to go," Madison said urgently. "Something's happening with Gran." The next hours passed in a blur of medical terms and decisions. A minor stroke, the doctors explained. Not immediately life-threatening, but a significant setback in her recovery. Madison signed forms, spoke with specialists, and tried to absorb the implications of this new development. By evening, her grandmother was stabilized but sedated. Madison sat beside her, physically and emotionally exhausted. A soft knock at the door made her look up to find Alexander standing there, holding a small bag from the hospital cafe. "Jason mentioned you hadn't answered his texts," he explained. "We were worried. I thought you might need this." He held out the bag, which contained a sandwich and coffee. The simple gesture of kindness broke through Madison's carefully maintained composure. Tears she'd been holding back all day suddenly flowed freely. Alexander crossed the room in 3 strides, setting down the food and pulling a chair beside her. Without hesitation, he placed an arm around her shoulders, offering quiet strength as she finally released the emotion she'd been containing. "I'm sorry," she managed after a few moments, embarrassed by her breakdown. "Never apologize for caring deeply," Alexander said quietly. "It's what makes you extraordinary." Madison looked up at him, struck by the genuine understanding in his expression. "I'm usually stronger than this." "You are the strongest person I know," he countered. "But even the strongest need support sometimes." They sat in companionable silence for a while, Madison drawing comfort from his presence. Finally, she spoke. "There's something I haven't told you about my connection to Prometheus," she began. "Something beyond my mother's treatment." Alexander listened intently as Madison revealed the full story. How her mother, a research nurse, had raised concerns about Nevirex's side effects during clinical trials, concerns that were documented but buried by Prometheus executives focused on fast-tracking the drug's approval. How those same executives had later denied any prior knowledge of risks when patients began experiencing severe complications. "My mother knew they were lying," Madison explained. "She had copies of her original reports that proved Prometheus knew about the risks and chose profit over patient safety." Alexander's expression grew increasingly troubled. "These reports were part of the lawsuit?" Madison shook her head. "No, Mom was already too sick when the class action began. She gave the documents to me, made me promise to use them to hold Prometheus accountable. But after she died, I was overwhelmed with grief and responsibility for Gran. By the time I tried to come forward, the settlement had been reached, the records sealed. And then, Wright Innovations acquired Prometheus," Alexander concluded, understanding dawning. "So the company I now lead is the one you believe covered up information that could have saved your mother?" "Yes," Madison admitted softly. "When I first learned Jason was your son, I thought it might be a way to finally fulfill my promise, to understand the company from the inside, perhaps eventually bring those documents to someone with the power to act on them." Alexander withdrew his arm, creating physical distance that mirrored his emotional retreat. "So your interest in Jason, in helping us, it was strategic." At first, Madison acknowledged, not flinching from the painful truth. "For about 5 minutes of our first meeting, then I saw a grieving child who reminded me of myself, and a father trying desperately to reach him. After that, the mission fell away. It became about Jason, about helping him heal." "And the documents? Do you still have them?" Madison nodded. "In a safety deposit box. I've never shown them to anyone." Alexander stood, pacing the small hospital room. "I need to know if those documents exist and what they contain. Not as Alexander Wright, but as CEO of a company that may have inherited serious ethical violations." "I understand," Madison said quietly. "But Alexander, this isn't just about corporate liability for me. It's about a promise to my mother. About all the families who never got real justice, just calculated settlements designed to silence them." Alexander turned to face her, his expression complex. "Do you believe I would bury evidence of wrongdoing to protect the company?" The question cut to the heart of their relationship. Madison considered carefully before answering. 6 months ago, I might have. Now, no. I believe you would want to know the truth, whatever the consequences." A fragile moment of trust hung between them, tested but not broken by her revelation. "When your grandmother is stable," Alexander said finally, I'd like to see those documents. If Prometheus executives knowingly concealed risks that harmed patients, that responsibility doesn't disappear just because ownership changed hands. Madison searched his face, looking for signs of the corporate calculation she'd expected. Instead, she found genuine ethical concern. Addressing this could have serious financial repercussions for Wright Innovations, she warned. Some things matter more than stock prices, Alexander replied, surprising her with words that echoed her own beliefs. Integrity isn't negotiable, Madison. If my company is built on a foundation that includes covering up harm to patients like your mother, I need to know. And I need to make it right. The sincerity in his voice reached something deep within Madison, challenging the last remnants of her suspicion. Perhaps the man she'd come to care for was exactly who he appeared to be. Someone who, despite his wealth and power, valued truth and justice over corporate protection. Before she could respond, her phone rang. The Portland Academy headmaster, calling for her decision about the teaching position. Madison glanced at Alexander, then answered. Dr. Winters, thank you for calling. I've given your offer careful consideration, but I've decided to remain in Seattle. A local opportunity has presented itself that allows me to continue my work here. After ending the call, she turned to Alexander. I'd like to know more about the Wright Foundation position. A cautious smile touched his lips. Does this mean you're considering it? I'm considering everything, Madison replied honestly, including the possibility that fulfilling my promise to my mother might look different than I originally thought. 2 days later, Madison's grandmother was stable enough for transfer to a rehabilitation facility. Alexander had quietly arranged for her to be admitted to Lakeside Recovery Center, widely regarded as the best in the region. Madison knew it typically had a 6-month waiting list. I didn't pull strings, he assured her when she questioned him about it. I just made sure they had all the medical information needed to properly assess her case. Madison wasn't entirely convinced, but her grandmother's needs took priority over her concerns about accepting help. The care at Lakeside was exemplary, the staff attentive and professional. For the first time in weeks, Madison felt she could breathe. With her grandmother settled, Madison returned to teaching, resuming Jason's tutoring sessions with a new awareness of the complex web of connections that had brought them together. Jason, perceptive as always, sensed something had shifted. Is everything okay between you and my dad? He asked during their Friday session. You both seem weird lately. Madison considered deflecting, but opted for measured honesty. We're working through some complicated history, nothing for you to worry about. Jason studied her skeptically. Does it have anything to do with why you were researching Prometheus Pharmaceuticals on the school computers last month? Madison nearly dropped the book she was holding. How did you know about that? Jason shrugged with teenage nonchalance. I help in the IT lab, remember? The search history showed up when I was doing maintenance. Prometheus is one of my dad's companies. Madison sat down, realizing Jason was more aware of the situation than she'd thought. It's connected to why I first became interested in working with you, she admitted. But Jason, my care for you has never been anything but genuine. I know that, he said with surprising certainty. Whatever happened in the past, I know who you are now. The simple faith in his statement touched Madison deeply. If Jason could separate her initial motives from the relationship they'd built, perhaps Alexander could too. That evening, Madison retrieved the sealed envelope from her safety deposit box. The documents inside represented years of pain, anger, and unresolved grief. They also represented a decision point, a choice between holding on to the past and embracing a possible future. Alexander had invited her to dinner at his home to discuss both the foundation position and the Prometheus documents. As her rideshare approached the Wright mansion, Madison felt a nervous flutter that had nothing to do with corporate ethics and everything to do with the man waiting inside. Jason greeted her at the door with unexpected enthusiasm. Dad's cooking, he announced with a grin. Which means we might need to order pizza as backup. The normalcy of the moment, a teenager teasing his father, a family dinner being prepared, contrasted sharply with the weight of the envelope in Madison's bag. For a brief moment, she considered leaving it there, unseen. But integrity demanded honesty, no matter the cost. Alexander appeared from the kitchen, looking more casual than she'd ever seen him in jeans and a simple button-down shirt. Don't listen to him. My culinary skills are vastly underrated. He burnt toast this morning, Jason stage whispered before disappearing upstairs, leaving the adults alone. He seems in good spirits, Madison observed. He is, Alexander confirmed. Having you in our lives has made an enormous difference, Madison. Whatever else happens, I want you to know that. The sincerity in his voice made her decision both harder and clearer. I brought the documents, she said, removing the envelope from her bag. But before we look at them, I need you to understand something. My mother's death changed me in ways I'm still discovering. For years, I channeled my grief into anger at Prometheus. It gave me purpose, direction. Alexander listened intently as she continued. Meeting you and Jason forced me to confront the limitations of that anger, to see that people aren't defined by the companies they lead or the mistakes they inherit. Real change doesn't come from exposing past wrongs alone, but from working with people of integrity to build something better. She held out the envelope. These documents may have legal and financial implications for Wright Innovations, but how you respond to them will tell me more about who you are than any corporate policy ever could. Alexander accepted the envelope with appropriate gravity. Would you prefer I review these privately first? Madison shook her head. No, I'd like us to look at them together. These were my mother's final legacy to me. Whatever we discover, I want to face it with clear eyes. Over the next hour, they reviewed the contents together at Alexander's dining room table. The documents painted a damning picture. Internal memos showing Prometheus executives had been warned about Neverx's liver toxicity issues during early trials, research notes documenting adverse reactions that were later omitted from FDA submissions, email exchanges discussing how to minimize these findings in public disclosures. Most damning was a memo from the then CEO instructing that Sophia Chen's concerns be managed appropriately to avoid delays in approval timelines. Alexander's expression grew increasingly troubled as they progressed through the evidence. When they finished, he sat back, visibly processing the implications. These people knowingly released a medication they knew could cause harm, he said finally, voice tight with controlled anger. They silenced your mother's warnings and then denied any prior knowledge when patients started dying. He looked up at Madison, his eyes reflecting genuine moral outrage. This isn't just corporate negligence, it's criminal. The validation of her mother's claims after so many years brought tears to Madison's eyes. Yes, but the statute of limitations has likely expired on most potential charges, and the settlement included clauses preventing further litigation. Alexander shook his head firmly. Legal limitations don't negate moral obligation. Wright Innovations acquired Prometheus, which means we inherited both their assets and their ethical failures. He reached across the table, taking her hand. Madison, I need time to consult with our legal team about options, but I promise you this. I will find a way to acknowledge what happened and make meaningful amends, not just to your family, but to all those affected. The sincerity in his voice reached something deep within Madison, dissolving the last barriers of distrust she'd maintained. That's all I ever wanted, she admitted softly. Not financial compensation, but acknowledgement of the truth. Recognition that my mother tried to prevent other families from suffering what we endured. Alexander squeezed her hand gently. Your mother was brave. Now I understand where you get your courage. Their eyes met across the table, the shared understanding creating a connection deeper than either had anticipated. Dad? Miss Chen? Dinner's getting cold, Jason called from the doorway, breaking the moment. He glanced curiously at the documents spread across the table. Everything okay? Alexander quickly gathered the papers, sliding them back into the envelope. Yes, just some important foundation business. Let's eat before my culinary masterpiece is ruined. The dinner that followed was surprisingly normal. Comfortable conversation, Jason's animated stories about school, Alexander's self-deprecating jokes about his cooking skills. For a few hours, Madison allowed herself to imagine belonging in this space, with these people who had unexpectedly become so important to her. Later, after Jason had gone upstairs to finish homework, Alexander and Madison moved to the living room to discuss the foundation position. The role would involve designing educational outreach programs for underserved communities, he explained. identifying deserving students for scholarships, creating mentorship opportunities. The salary is competitive with full benefits that would cover your grandmother's care. It sounds perfect, Madison admitted. Almost too perfect. Alexander smiled wryly. I won't pretend the timing isn't convenient for both of us, but Madison, this isn't charity or compensation for the documents. The foundation needs someone with your experience and perspective. Someone who understands both sides of the educational divide. Madison considered his words carefully. And the personal complications? If I accept this position, how do we navigate our relationship? Whatever it might be becoming. Alexander's expression grew serious. Professionally, you would report to the foundation board, not directly to me. Personally. He paused, choosing his words with care. I believe we've begun something worth exploring if you're willing. Something that could enrich both our lives. And Jason's too. The honesty in his words resonated with Madison's own feelings. What had begun as a mission of justice had transformed into something far more complex and precious. A connection built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine care. I need a little time, she said finally. Not because I'm uncertain about the position or about us, but because accepting means truly letting go of the past. Transforming my promise to my mother from one of retribution to one of positive change. Alexander nodded, understanding. Take all the time you need. Whatever you decide. Those documents will be addressed appropriately. That's a promise from me to you. As Madison prepared to leave, Alexander walked her to the door. In the quiet privacy of the entryway, he took her hands in his. Whatever you decide about the foundation, I hope you'll remain in Jason's life. He needs you. Madison looked up at him, seeing past the wealthy businessman to the caring father beneath. Just Jason? She asked softly. Alexander's gaze was unwavering. No, not just Jason. The simple admission hung between them, full of possibility. On impulse, Madison rose on tiptoes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. I'll call you tomorrow, she promised. Outside in the cool evening air, Madison felt lighter than she had in years. The documents were no longer her burden alone. Her mother's voice had finally been heard by someone with the power to acknowledge the truth. And somewhere along the way, her mission of justice had expanded to include healing. Not just for Jason and Alexander, but for herself as well. What she couldn't know was that Alexander was already on the phone with his legal team, setting in motion a process that would not only address Prometheus's past wrongs, but potentially transform Wright Innovation's approach to corporate responsibility. Or that Jason, watching from his bedroom window, was already planning ways to ensure Madison became a permanent part of their family. The path forward remained uncertain, complicated by the weight of the past and the vulnerability of new beginnings. But for the first time since her mother's death, Madison felt the future held more promise than pain. The mission that had driven her for 8 years was transforming into something her mother would have valued even more. A chance to create positive change from within, alongside people whose integrity matched her own. As her car pulled away from the Wright mansion, Madison made a new promise, not to the past, but to the future. A promise to honor her mother's memory not through anger, but through the kind of courage, compassion, and integrity Sophia Chen had exemplified in her own life. A promise to remain true to her principles while opening her heart to new possibilities, including the possibility that sometimes healing comes in unexpected forms, like a troubled teenager finding his voice, a grieving father learning to connect, and a dedicated teacher discovering that the greatest lessons often come from the journey itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.